December 1973, Washington, D.C. A letter arrives at the White House. It is from one of the richest women in America. She is offering the government a gift, a 128-room palace in Palm Beach, Florida, worth at least $20 million. She will give it for free. Just take it off her hands, please. The government refuses. They do not want her palace. The rejection breaks her. Within months, she will be dead. The estate she built to prove her greatness had become her prison. This is the story of Marjorie Merriweather Post and the mansion that destroyed her, Mar-a-Lago. The woman writing that desperate letter was 86 years old. Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post. Most Americans knew her as the Post Cereal Heiress, the woman whose family name appeared on boxes of grape, nuts and Post Toasties in millions of kitchens. But Marjorie was far more than a name on a cereal box. At her peak, she was the wealthiest woman in America. Her fortune exceeded that of most industrialists. She had owned yachts, jewels, and estates that rivaled European royalty, and she had built Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago sat on 17 acres in Palm Beach, Florida. The estate stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth, sea to lake. The name meant exactly that in Spanish, sea to lake. The mansion itself contained 128 rooms, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, a 75-foot tower, imported Spanish tiles covered walls and floors, gold leaf decorated ceilings. The furniture came from European palaces. The grounds featured formal gardens, fountains, and a 9-hole golf course. It was the most elaborate private residence in Florida, possibly in all of America. Marjorie had built it in the 1920s, the era of unlimited wealth and zero income tax, when building a palace was not just acceptable but expected, when America's richest families competed to create the most lavish estates, when excess was celebrated rather than criticized. Mar-a-Lago was her masterpiece, her statement, her proof that an American woman could create something as grand as anything European aristocrats possessed. She had succeeded spectacularly. The palace was magnificent. Everyone agreed on that. But by 1973, magnificence was not enough. The world had changed. The 1920s were half a century gone. The values that had created Mar-a-Lago had disappeared. Excess was no longer celebrated. It was embarrassing. Maintaining a 128-room palace required enormous resources. Staff, repairs, taxes, insurance. The costs never stopped. Marjorie had spent 46 winters at Mar-a-Lago. She had entertained presidents and ambassadors there. She had filled it with parties and guests in life. But now she was old. The parties had stopped. The guests were gone. She was alone in 128 rooms with memories and bills. She had tried to sell it. No buyers appeared. Who could afford to purchase a 128-room palace? Who could afford to operate it? The annual costs exceeded $1 million just for maintenance and staff. That did not include improvements or renovations. Just keeping it running consumed a fortune. There was no market for such a property. It was too large, too expensive, too impractical. The world had moved on from private palaces. Marjorie could not move on. She was trapped. So she tried to give it away. That was what the letter to the White House proposed. Take Mar-a-Lago. Use it as a winter White House. Presidents could vacation there. Foreign dignitaries could stay there. It would serve the nation. She would donate it completely. All 17 acres. All 128 rooms. All the furnishings and art. Everything free. Just take it. Please. The government studied the proposal. They sent people to inspect the property. They calculated the costs. And they said no. The operating expenses were too high. The government could not justify spending $1 million annually on a vacation residence. The answer was no. That rejection was the final blow. Marjorie had built Mar-a-Lago to achieve immortality, to create something permanent that would outlast her, to prove she was more than a cereal heiress, more than a woman who inherited money. She was a builder, a creator, a patron of architecture and beauty. Mar-a-Lago was supposed to be her legacy, but now no one wanted it. Not buyers, not charities, not even the government when offered for free. The palace had become worthless, or worse than worthless. It was a burden no one would accept. Marjorie Merriweather Post died on September 12, 1973. Heart failure, the doctors said. But everyone close to her knew the truth. She died of a broken heart. The mansion she had built with such hope and pride had consumed the last years of her life. It had drained her finances and her spirit. It stood as a monument not to her achievement, but to her failure. The palace that was meant to elevate her had become the cage that trapped her. And when she died, the battle over Mar-a-Lago had only just begun. To understand how it came to this, you have to go back to the beginning. To a small town in Michigan in the 1890s. To a man named C.B.U. Post who had a vision for breakfast cereal. To a fortune built from grain and marketing genius. To a daughter who would inherit everything. And to the moment when massive wealth and terrible loss collided in ways that would shape the rest of her life. The story of Mar-a-Lago begins not in Palm Beach, but in Battle Creek, Michigan, with a man who changed how America ate breakfast, and whose death would change his daughter forever. Charles William Post was born in 1854 in Illinois. His family was comfortable but not wealthy. Post worked various jobs in his youth: sales, suspenders manufacturing, real estate. He was ambitious and energetic but never quite successful. By his 30s, he was struggling. His businesses failed. His health collapsed. He suffered what doctors then called nervous exhaustion. Today we would recognize it as severe depression. Post checked himself into a sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, a place run by John Harvey Kellogg, a doctor who believed proper diet could cure almost anything. Kellogg served patients grain-based foods, coffee substitutes made from roasted grains, breakfast cereals that were supposed to be healthier than traditional foods. Post recovered at the sanitarium. Whether the food cured him or he simply recovered naturally is unclear. But Post emerged convinced that grain-based breakfast foods were the future. He opened his own facility in Battle Creek. Not a sanitarium exactly, more of a wellness center, and he began experimenting with cereal products. In 1895, Post introduced Postum, a coffee substitute made from roasted wheat and molasses. It tasted nothing like coffee, but Post marketed it brilliantly. He claimed it was healthier than coffee, better for digestion, better for nerves, better for everything. Americans bought it. Postum became a hit. Post made his first fortune, but he was just getting started. In 1897, he introduced Grape Nuts, a cereal made from wheat and barley, baked into hard blocks then crumbled. It contained no grapes, no nuts. The name was pure marketing, but it worked. Post claimed Grape Nuts cured appendicitis, cured malaria, cured loose teeth. None of this was true, but advertising regulations barely existed. Post could claim anything, and he did. Grape Nuts became one of the most popular cereals in America. Post was a marketing genius. He spent enormous sums on advertising. He created memorable slogans. He targeted women who made food purchasing decisions. He built a distribution network that got his products into stores nationwide. By 1900, the Post Cereal Company was one of the largest food companies in America. By 1910, it was an empire. C.B. Post was a multimillionaire many times over. He had done it all himself. Built from nothing. He was a self-made success story, but the success came with costs. Post worked constantly. He drove himself and everyone around him relentlessly. He suffered recurring bouts of depression. He tried various treatments, rest cures, travel. Nothing worked permanently. The mental illness that had sent him to Battle Creek in the 1890s never fully left. It lurked, waiting. Post tried to outrun it by working harder, by building more, by achieving more. But you cannot outrun your own mind. Post had one daughter, Marjorie, born in 1887, his only child. He doted on her. She grew up in privilege that Post himself had never known as a child. Private schools, European travel, every advantage money could provide. But she also grew up watching her father battle demons she did not understand. The mood swings, the desperate energy followed by black despair. She learned early that wealth could not buy peace, that success did not equal happiness. These were lessons she would remember. By 1914, C.B. Post was 59 years old, enormously wealthy, hugely successful, respected and admired. But mentally he was failing. The depression was worse than ever. He became convinced he had stomach cancer. Doctors found no cancer. But he could not be reassured. He was dying, he insisted. He knew it. His family tried to help. Nothing worked. On May 9, 1914, at his estate in California, C.U. Post shot himself. He used a hunting rifle. He died instantly. The newspapers called it suicide during temporary insanity. His family called it a tragedy. His daughter called it the day her life changed forever. Marjorie was 27 years old. She was married to a man named Edward Close. They had 2 daughters. She was living a comfortable life as a wealthy man's daughter. Then her father died and everything changed. C.U. Post left his entire fortune to Marjorie, the company, the estates, the investments, everything. His will made her one of the wealthiest women in America instantly. The estate was valued at over $250 million in total assets. In 1914, that was an almost incomprehensible sum. Adjusted for inflation, it would exceed $5 billion today. Marjorie was suddenly responsible for a massive food company, for thousands of employees, for business decisions that affected millions of consumers. She was 27 years old. She had no business training, no preparation for this, but she had inherited her father's drive, his intelligence, his ambition. She took control of the Post cereal company. She learned the business. She hired good managers. She made smart decisions. The company thrived under her ownership. She proved she was more than just an heiress. She was a capable businesswoman. But the money and power came with her father's ghost. He had built everything she now owned. He had died by his own hand. She had not been able to save him. That guilt never left her. She wondered if the business had killed him, if the pressure had been too much, if she should hate the company that had destroyed her father. But she could not hate it. It was his legacy, his achievement. Destroying it would dishonor him. So she preserved it. She built on it. She tried to prove worthy of his sacrifice. The marriage to Edward Close did not survive the transformation. Close was a decent man, but unprepared to be married to one of the wealthiest women in America. Before her father's death, he had been the provider, the head of household. After the inheritance, Marjorie controlled everything: the money, the decisions, the future. Close could not adjust to the reversal. They divorced in 1919. Marjorie was 32 years old, enormously wealthy, single, and looking for something her money could not buy: respect. Not the kind that comes from inherited wealth, but the kind earned through personal achievement. In 1920, Marjorie married Edward Francis Hutton. E.F. Hutton was a stockbroker who had founded his own firm, E.F. Hutton & Company. He was wealthy in his own right, not post-level wealthy, but successful and confident. He did not need Marjorie's money. That made him different from most men who pursued her. Hutton could be a partner rather than a dependent. They married and combined their fortunes. Hutton helped manage her investments. He advised on business decisions. They made a powerful team. The marriage seemed like it might work. For a while it did. Hutton introduced Marjorie to a different level of society. The Huttons moved in circles of old money and new power. They entertained constantly. They traveled extensively. They maintained homes in New York, the Adirondacks, and eventually Palm Beach. Marjorie discovered that wealth could buy access but not acceptance. The old money families tolerated her. They attended her parties. They accepted her invitations. But they never quite forgot she was a serial heiress. Her grandfather had not fought in the Revolution. Her ancestors had not signed the Declaration of Independence. She was new money. Recent money. That distinction mattered in the 1920s. Marjorie decided she would force acceptance. Not by changing herself, but by building something so magnificent that no one could ignore her. She would create an estate that rivaled anything the old money families possessed. Something that proved she had taste and vision equal to any European aristocrat. She began looking for the perfect location, the perfect canvas for her ambition. She found it in Palm Beach, Florida. Palm Beach in 1920 was already established as the winter playground for America's wealthy. Henry Flagler had developed the island beginning in the 1890s. He built the Royal Poinciana Hotel. He brought the railroad. He created the infrastructure that made Palm Beach accessible and desirable. By 1920, the best families were building winter estates there. The Vanderbilts, the Stotesburys, the Phippses. names that represented railroad fortunes, banking wealth, and industrial empires. Marjorie visited Palm Beach and recognized immediately what it offered: climate, beauty, social opportunity, and land. The property she identified was extraordinary. 17 acres stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth. Sea to lake. No other estate in Palm Beach had that distinction. Most properties faced either ocean or lake. Not both. The land had been assembled from multiple parcels. It was expensive, but Marjorie did not care about expense. She cared about what could be built there. She envisioned a palace, not a house, not an estate, a palace. Something that would make people stop and stare. Something that would force recognition. Something that would be her legacy. She hired architects and gave them an impossible mandate: create the most beautiful residence in America. Cost was no object. Beauty was everything. The architects were Marion Sims Wyeth and Joseph Urban. Wyeth was a Palm Beach specialist who understood the climate and local construction. Urban was a theater designer who understood drama and spectacle. Together they created something that was part Spanish villa, part Moorish palace, part Venetian fantasy. The style was eclectic. Some critics would later call it confused, but no one could call it boring. Mar-a-Lago was designed to overwhelm. Construction began in 1924. The cost was estimated at $2 million. That estimate was absurd. The final cost exceeded $7 million. Over budget by 3.5 times. In 1920s dollars, $7 million was an astronomical sum, equivalent to roughly $125 million today. But Marjorie did not care. She wanted perfection. She got perfection. At any price. The scale was staggering: 128 rooms. The count included 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, 12 fireplaces, and 3 bomb shelters. The bomb shelters were Edward Hutton's idea. He worried about kidnapping and violence. The 1920s were the era of prohibition and gangsters. Wealthy families were targets. The shelters were built into the foundation: reinforced concrete, ventilation systems, supplies for extended occupation. They were never used, but their existence revealed the anxieties beneath the luxury. The materials came from everywhere. Marjorie insisted on authenticity. No imitations, no substitutes. If the design called for Spanish tiles, they would be Spanish tiles. Actually from Spain. She imported 36,000 Moorish tiles from Spain, each one selected individually, each one shipped carefully. The cost was insane, but the effect was spectacular. The tiles covered walls and floors throughout the house. They created patterns and colors that changed with the light. They were art you walked on. The tower rose 75 feet above the main house. It was visible for miles. The purpose was partly practical. It provided views of both ocean and lake, but mostly it was symbolic. Towers meant castles. Castles meant nobility. Marjorie was building an American castle. The tower announced that from far away. You could not miss Mar-a-Lago. The tower made sure of it. The gold leaf was applied by Italian craftsmen brought to Florida specifically for this project. They covered ceilings in gold. Not paint that looked like gold, actual gold leaf. Thin sheets of real gold pressed onto plaster. The gold caught light and reflected it. The ceilings glowed. The effect was both beautiful and excessive, which was exactly the point. Beauty alone was not enough. It had to be excessive. It had to overwhelm. It had to prove that Marjorie could spend money on beauty without concern for cost. The furniture and art came from European estates and auction houses. Marjorie bought entire rooms of antique furniture. She purchased tapestries from French chateaus. She acquired paintings by old masters. She filled Mar-a-Lago with objects that had histories, that had belonged to aristocrats and royalty. She was surrounding herself with the physical remnants of European nobility. If she could not inherit their bloodlines, she could at least own their possessions. The construction employed over 1,000 workers at its peak. Architects, engineers, craftsmen, laborers. The workers came from across America and Europe. Some were hired locally. Others were brought in for specialized work. The tile layers, the gold leaf artists, the stone carvers. The project was so large that it created its own economy. Local suppliers prospered. Boarding houses filled with workers. The construction of Mar-a-Lago pumped money into Palm Beach at a time when the economy was booming. But the construction also created problems. The timeline kept extending. The costs kept rising. The complications multiplied. Building in Florida presented challenges northern architects had not anticipated. The humidity, the salt air, the hurricanes. The foundation had to be engineered to withstand tropical storms. The materials had to resist corrosion from salt spray. The house had to be cooled somehow in summer even though air conditioning barely existed. The solutions were expensive and time-consuming. Edward Hutton watched the cost spiral with growing concern. His wife was spending millions on a vacation house, $7 million on a place they would use 3 or 4 months per year. The mathematics made no sense. But Marjorie was beyond reason. This was not about mathematics. This was about legacy, about proving herself, about creating something permanent. Hutton tried to argue. Marjorie refused to listen. The project continued. The bills mounted. The marriage began to crack. The house finally opened in January 1927. 3 years of construction. $7 million spent. The result was undeniably spectacular. Guests approached through gates and up a long drive lined with palm trees. The house emerged gradually. First the tower, then the main facade. The impact was calculated. By the time you reached the entrance, you were already overwhelmed. Inside was even more impressive. The entrance hall featured a huge fountain. The floors were marble and tile. The ceilings soared overhead covered in gold. The furniture looked like it belonged in museums, which it probably did. The public rooms were designed for entertaining on a grand scale. The living room could hold 100 people comfortably. The dining room seated 40. There was a ballroom for dancing, a library for quiet conversation, a morning room for informal gatherings. Every space had a purpose. Every space was beautiful. The house functioned as a stage where Marjorie could perform her role as great hostess and patron. The private quarters were equally lavish. Marjorie's bedroom suite occupied an entire wing. Multiple rooms connected by private passages. Her bedroom was enormous. Her closets were the size of most people's bedrooms. Her bathroom featured gold fixtures and marble walls. She had a private balcony overlooking the ocean. Everything was designed for maximum luxury and comfort. No expense was spared. No desire was left unfulfilled. The guest bedrooms numbered in the dozens. Each was decorated individually. Each had its own character and style. Some were Spanish. Some were Italian. Some were French. Guests could choose based on preference. Or Marjorie could assign rooms based on her sense of what suited each visitor. The number of guest rooms revealed Marjorie's vision. This was not just her winter house. This was a destination. A place where America's elite would gather. Where she would reign as hostess. Where her position would be undeniable. The first season at Mar-a-Lago was everything Marjorie hoped. The parties were legendary. The guests were important. Ambassadors, senators, business leaders, society figures. Everyone who mattered came to Mar-a-Lago. The invitations were coveted. Being invited meant you had arrived. Marjorie had achieved her goal. She had forced acceptance through sheer magnificence. No one could ignore Mar-a-Lago. Therefore, no one could ignore her. But the triumph was brief. The costs of operating Mar-a-Lago were as staggering as the construction costs had been. The estate required a staff of 60 to 70 people year-round. Groundskeepers, housekeepers, cooks, maids, butlers, security guards, maintenance workers. The payroll alone exceeded $200,000 annually. Then came utilities, heating and cooling a 128-room palace, the electricity for lighting, the water for fountains and pools. The costs were enormous. Add property taxes, insurance, and routine maintenance. The annual operating budget exceeded $1 million. Every year, just to keep it running. Marjorie could afford it in 1927. She was enormously wealthy. The Post-Cereal Company generated substantial income. Her investments were sound. $1 million annually was manageable. But it was not sustainable indefinitely. And there were warning signs. The expenses never decreased. They only grew. Each year brought new repairs, new improvements, new costs. Mar-a-Lago was not just a house. It was a money-consuming machine that never stopped demanding more. The marriage to Edward Hutton did not survive Mar-a-Lago. The problems had been building since construction began. But by 1930, the situation was impossible. Hutton had initially supported the project. He understood that his wife wanted to create something significant. But as costs spiraled and the house became an obsession, his support turned to resentment. He had his own career, his own achievements. His brokerage firm was successful and respected. But none of it mattered. He was always introduced as Marjorie Merriweather Poset's husband, never as E.F. Hutton, founder of his own company. Always as her appendage. Mar-a-Lago made it worse. The house was entirely Marjorie's creation. Her vision, her money, her palace. Hutton had no role except as the husband who lived there. When they entertained, she was the hostess. He was the host by marriage. The distinction ate at him. He was a successful man reduced to being Mr. Post. The palace that was supposed to elevate Marjorie diminished everyone around her, including and especially her husband. Hutton began spending more time in New York. Business, he claimed. But the truth was simpler. He needed to be somewhere he was his own person, where people knew him for his achievements rather than his wife's money. The separations grew longer. The conversations grew shorter. By 1935, the marriage was over in everything but name. They divorced that year. Hutton remarried quickly, a younger woman, someone who did not overshadow him, someone whose fortune did not make his success look small. The divorce devastated Marjorie. She had not seen it coming, or perhaps she had refused to see it. She loved Hutton. She thought he loved her. But love could not survive the inequality their wealth created. He could not be her equal when she was so much richer. No man could. Her fortune was both her power and her curse. It gave her independence and options, but it made genuine partnership impossible. Any man who married her would always be less wealthy, less powerful, less important. The resentment was inevitable. Hutton had lasted longer than most would, but he still left. Marjorie was 48 years old, divorced twice, wealthy beyond measure, and lonely in a way money could not fix. She had Mar-a-Lago, the palace she had built to prove her greatness. But what was the point of a palace if you were alone in it? She filled it with guests. She threw parties. She kept the social calendar full. But at the end of the night, everyone went home or to their guest rooms. And Marjorie was alone in her enormous suite, in a house with 128 rooms, with staff everywhere, and still completely alone. In 1935, Marjorie married for a third time. Joseph E. Davies was a lawyer and diplomat. He had been U.S. ambassador to Soviet Union under President Roosevelt. He was intelligent, ambitious, and politically connected. He was also considerably less wealthy than Marjorie. But he had something Hutton lacked. He had ego large enough to handle being married to a richer woman, or so it seemed at first. Davies understood what Mar-a-Lago could offer his career. The estate was perfect for entertaining diplomats and politicians, for hosting events that mixed social prestige with political influence. Davies saw Mar-a-Lago not as a burden but as an asset, a tool he could use. Marjorie was happy to have the house used this way. If Mar-a-Lago could serve a purpose beyond her own glorification, perhaps it justified its costs. Perhaps it had meaning beyond excess. Throughout the late 1930s and 1940s, Mar-a-Lago became a center for diplomatic entertaining. Ambassadors visited. Foreign dignitaries were hosted. Political figures vacationed there. Marjorie played the role of hostess with skill and grace. She knew how to make important people comfortable, how to create an atmosphere that encouraged conversation and connection. Mar-a-Lago was the perfect setting, beautiful enough to impress, comfortable enough to relax, exclusive enough to matter. During World War II, Marjorie threw herself into patriotic activities. She loaned her yacht to the U.S. Navy. She contributed money to war bonds. She used Mar-a-Lago for fundraising events supporting the military. The house that had been criticized as excessive became a symbol of American wealth used for national purposes. The criticism quieted, at least temporarily. In wartime, even Mar-a-Lago could be justified, but the war changed everything. Not immediately. The changes were subtle at first, but they were real and irreversible. Before the war, American society had tolerated enormous displays of wealth. The gap between rich and poor was accepted as natural. The wealthy could build palaces, and no one questioned their right to do so. The war changed that attitude. Millions of Americans served in military. They saw combat. They sacrificed. When they returned home, the old social order looked different. Excessive wealth seemed less impressive, more offensive even. The tax system changed too. The federal government needed money to pay war debts. Income taxes rose dramatically. Estate taxes became significant. The tax rate on the wealthiest Americans reached levels that would have been unimaginable before the war. Suddenly, maintaining enormous wealth across generations became difficult. The money that funded estates like Mar-a-Lago was being taxed away. The economics that had made the Gilded Age possible were disappearing. Marjorie felt the pressure. Her fortune was still substantial, but it was shrinking. Not from bad investments, from taxes, from operating costs, from the simple fact that even enormous wealth can be consumed if you spend enough annually. Mar-a-Lago alone was costing over $1 million every year just to maintain. That did not include renovations or improvements. Just maintaining what existed, $1 million annually forever. The mathematics were brutal. The Post-Cereal Company was sold in 1929 to a larger food conglomerate. Marjorie retained significant shares, but she was no longer in control. The dividends still came, but they were smaller than the profits she had controlled before. Her income was declining while her expenses remained constant. For the first time since inheriting her father's fortune, Marjorie had to think about money. Not because she was poor. She was still worth tens of millions. But the trajectory was wrong. If expenses exceeded income indefinitely, even the largest fortune eventually disappears. The marriage to Davies survived through the war and into the early 1950s. But like the marriage to Hutton, it could not survive Marjorie's wealth. Davies wanted to be important in his own right. But living at Mar-a-Lago, he was always Marjorie's husband, the ambassador who married the serial heiress. His achievements were footnotes to her fortune. The resentment built slowly. By 1955, Davies had had enough. They divorced. He took a generous settlement, including, bizarrely, much of Marjorie's jewelry collection. Russian jewels she had acquired during Davies's time as ambassador. He claimed they were his. She gave them up rather than fight. She was tired of fighting. Marjorie was 68 years old, divorced 3 times. Still wealthy but less so every year. Still maintaining Mar-a-Lago. Still hosting. Still entertaining. But why? For whom? Her daughters had their own lives. Her grandchildren visited occasionally. But the house was too large for one elderly woman. The staff outnumbered the residents. The palace that was supposed to be her crowning achievement had become an obligation she could not escape. She tried to reduce costs. She closed off sections of the house that were not in use. She reduced staff slightly. She cut back on the parties. But the basic expenses remained: taxes, insurance, utilities. These costs could not be eliminated. Only paying them every year forever, or selling. But who would buy Mar-a-Lago? Who could afford it? The purchase price would be millions. The operating costs would be crushing. No individual could justify such expense. Not anymore. The world had changed. Private palaces were relics. Embarrassing reminders of an era everyone wanted to forget. Marjorie briefly married a 4th time in 1958. Herbert May was a businessman. The marriage lasted less than 4 years. It was a mistake from the beginning. Marjorie May knew it. They divorced in 1964. She was 77 years old. She would not marry again. 4 marriages. All ended in divorce or death. The common factor was her wealth. The fortune that gave her power had made true partnership impossible. Every man who married her eventually realized he would always be secondary. Would always be less. The resentment destroyed the marriages. Every time. By the mid-1960s, Marjorie was facing reality. She could not maintain Mar-a-Lago indefinitely. The costs were consuming her remaining fortune. She needed to do something. Sell it, don it, give it away, something. She tried selling first. She listed the property with brokers. The asking price was reasonable given the scale and location. But no buyers came. Not one. The property was too unique, too expensive to operate, too impractical for modern life. No one wanted a 128-room palace that cost $1 million annually just to keep the lights on. She tried approaching charitable organizations, museums, universities, cultural foundations. Would any of them want Mar-a-Lago? They could use it for conferences, for special events, for anything they wanted. She would donate it completely, along with an endowment to help with operating costs. The organizations thanked her politely and declined. None of them could justify the expense. Even with an endowment, the ongoing costs would overwhelm most institutional budgets. They could not accept such a burden, no matter how beautiful it was. In 1972, Marjorie made a final attempt. She approached the federal government. Would they accept Mar-a-Lago as a winter White House? Presidents could vacation there. Foreign leaders could be hosted there. It would serve the nation. She would donate everything, all 17 acres, all contents. Completely free? Just take it, please. Someone just take it off her hands. She was 85 years old. She could not keep doing this. The palace had become her prison. She was trapped by the things she had built to free her from obscurity. The government sent officials to Palm Beach. They inspected Mar-a-Lago thoroughly. They calculated costs. They prepared reports. The reports were devastating. Yes, Mar-a-Lago was beautiful. Yes, it was historic. Yes, it could serve as a winter White House. But the operating costs were prohibitive. Over $1 million annually. For a vacation residence. When the government was cutting budgets and facing criticism for waste. The optics were terrible. The costs were unjustifiable. The answer was no. The government would not accept Mar-a-Lago even as a gift, even for free. The palace no one wanted. The rejection letter arrived in December 1973. Marjorie read it alone in her study. The government did not want her palace. No one wanted it. She had spent $7 million building it. She had spent 46 winters living there. She had poured her heart and fortune into making it perfect. And it was worthless. Worse than worthless. It was a burden she could not escape and could not give away. She wept at 86 years old, alone in 128 rooms. She wept for what her ambition had cost her. The rejection from the federal government destroyed something inside Marjorie. For months, she had hoped someone would take Mar-a-Lago. Someone would recognize its value. Someone would want it. The government had been her last realistic option. If they refused, there was no one left to ask. She was trapped. She owned a palace she could no longer afford to maintain, that she could not sell, that she could not give away. The things she had built to prove her greatness had become the proof of her failure. Her health began to fail rapidly after the rejection. She had always been strong and energetic. Age had slowed her but not stopped her. Now she seemed to collapse inward. She stopped entertaining. She stopped going out. She rarely left her bedroom suit. The staff worried. Her daughters visited and found her distant, lost. She was living but not alive. The palace had consumed everything else in her life. Now it was consuming her. The final months were lonely beyond description. Mar-a-Lago had 128 rooms. 60 staff members lived on the property or worked there daily. But Marjorie was alone. She ate meals by herself in rooms designed for 40 guests. She walked through halls meant for parties that no longer happened. She sat in the tower looking at views she had spent a fortune to acquire. And she felt nothing. The beauty that had once moved her now seemed empty. Meaningless. What was the point of owning paradise if you were miserable in it? She thought often about her father. CBU Post had built a fortune and then destroyed himself. She had inherited that fortune and built Mar-a-Lago. Was she destroying herself too? Was this palace her version of his depression? A different form of the same self-destruction. He had used a gun. She had used architecture. But the result was the same. Building something that consumed you from within. Creating something that became impossible to escape. On September 12, 1973, Marjorie Merriweather Post died of heart failure. She was 86 years old. She died in her bedroom at Mar-a-Lago. In the palace she had built. In the trap she could not escape. The official cause was heart failure. But everyone who knew her understood the truth. She died of a broken heart. The rejection had been the final blow. when even the government refused her gift. When even giving it away for free was not enough, something inside her gave up. She stopped fighting, and her body followed her spirit. The funeral was private, small, family only. There were no crowds, no grand ceremonies. The woman who had entertained presidents and ambassadors was buried quietly. Mar-a-Lago was closed. The staff was dismissed. The rooms were locked. The palace stood empty for the first time since it had opened 46 years earlier. Silent. Waiting. The question everyone asked was simple. What happens now? Marjorie's will divided her fortune among her daughters and grandchildren. The cash and investments were distributed without controversy. But Mar-a-Lago was a problem. No one in the family wanted it. They all understood what owning it would mean: the expenses, the responsibilities, the impossible burden. The will designated that Mar-a-Lago should be offered to the government one more time. If they refused again, the estate could be sold. But selling meant accepting enormous losses. The family understood that. They hoped the government would reconsider. The government did reconsider, very briefly. The answer was still no. The costs remained prohibitive. The optics remained terrible. Nothing had changed since Marjorie first offered it. Nothing would change. Mar-a-Lago would never be a winter White House. The estate would have to be sold, or given to someone willing to take it. The family braced themselves for years of trying to unload the property. In 1973, Mar-a-Lago was appraised at $20 million. That was the theoretical value based on land, building, and contents. But theoretical value meant nothing if no buyers existed. The estate was listed for sale at a realistic price, far below appraisal. The family just wanted someone to take it. Anyone. The listing attracted some interest, people toward the property. Real estate speculators studied the numbers, but no one made offers. The operating costs scared everyone away. You could buy the palace, but then you were stuck with it forever, or until you found someone else willing to take the burden. The estate sat empty for several years. The family paid for minimal maintenance, enough to prevent vandalism and decay, but no more than necessary. The costs were still substantial even with the house closed. The family bled money keeping the property secure. They became desperate. They would accept almost any reasonable offer. Almost any buyer willing to take on Mar-a-Lago. In 1980, something unexpected happened. The Post Foundation, which Marjorie had established, considered turning Mar-a-Lago into an exclusive private club. Not a hotel, not a resort. A club where wealthy members paid annual dues for access. The members would share the costs through their dues. No single person would bear the full burden. The foundation could maintain the property through membership revenue. It seemed like a possible solution. But the foundation lacked resources to operate a club. They lacked expertise in that industry, and they faced zoning challenges. Palm Beach had strict regulations about commercial use of residential properties. Converting Mar-a-Lago to a club would require approvals from multiple authorities. The foundation explored the option but made little progress. The estate continued sitting empty. The family continued paying to maintain it. The situation was unsustainable. In 1985, a developer from New York expressed interest. His name was Donald Trump. He was 43 years old. He had made a fortune in Manhattan real estate. He was known for bold deals and aggressive negotiations. He saw potential in Mar-a-Lago that others had missed, not as a private residence, not as a winter White House, but as a business, as a club, as a brand. Trump understood something crucial. Mar-a-Lago was not a house. It was a name, a reputation, a symbol. Those things had value in ways real estate alone did not. Trump negotiated with the estate for months. He was patient. He let them understand he was their only realistic option. No one else was offering to buy. No one else was interested. He had leverage and he used it ruthlessly. His final offer was $8 million. $5 million for the land and buildings, $3 million for the furnishings and contents. Total of $8 million. For a property that had been appraised at $20 million. That had cost over $7 million to build in 1927. Not counting the 46 years of operating expenses, the loss was staggering. The estate accepted. They had no choice. $8 million was better than continuing to pay maintenance costs forever. Better than letting the property decay. Better than the embarrassment of a palace no one wanted. The sale closed in December 1985. Trump became the owner of Mar-a-Lago. The estate that had destroyed Marjorie Merriweather Post passed to a man who saw it as an opportunity rather than a burden. Who understood how to monetize beauty? Who knew how to turn liability into asset? Trump's plans were ambitious. He would convert Mar-a-Lago into the most exclusive private club in America. Membership would cost $100,000 initially. Later it would rise to $200,000. Members would pay annual dues of $14,000. For that, they would get access to a palace. They could dine there, swim there, play tennis and golf there, attend parties and events. They would be members of Mar-a-Lago. The name itself was the product. The exclusivity was what they were buying. But the conversion required approvals from Palm Beach authorities. The town did not want Mar-a-Lago becoming a club. The neighbors opposed it. They worried about traffic, about noise, about their property values, about strangers having access to a property that had been private for 6 decades. Trump faced years of negotiations and legal battles. He filed lawsuits. He negotiated agreements. He made concessions. Slowly, he wore down the opposition. One of his strategies was brilliant. He threatened to subdivide Mar-a-Lago. If the town would not let him operate a club, he would divide the 17 acres into house lots. He would sell them to developers. Multiple mansions would replace the single estate. The traffic would be worse. The character of the neighborhood would change permanently. The threat worked. The town decided that one private club was preferable to multiple private estates. They granted the approvals. In 1995, Mar-a-Lago opened as a private club. The irony was perfect and painful. Marjorie had spent $7 million building Mar-a-Lago. She had spent millions more maintaining it for 46 years. She had tried desperately to give it away. She had died heartbroken when no one would take it. Trump bought it for $8 million, turned it into a club, and made it profitable. The palace that destroyed its creator made its new owner wealthier and more famous. Marjorie's failure was Trump's triumph. The estate that had been her cage became his crown. The transformation revealed something brutal about wealth and legacy. Marjorie had built Mar-a-Lago for personal glory, for private prestige. She wanted to own the most beautiful estate in America. To prove she was more than a serial heiress, the palace was supposed to be hers alone. Exclusive, private, a reflection of her singular greatness. That possessiveness was what made it unsustainable. No single person could justify the costs. No single person should own something that expensive just for personal use. The economics did not work. Trump understood that great properties must serve multiple people, must generate revenue, must be businesses rather than vanities. He converted Mar-a-Lago from a private palace to a shared asset. Hundreds of members enjoyed it instead of one owner. The costs were spread. The revenue exceeded the expenses. The business model worked. Marjorie could have done the same thing decades earlier, but she refused. She wanted to own it completely. That refusal destroyed her. That flexibility saved Trump. The other irony was timing. Marjorie built Mar-a-Lago at the peak of the 1920s boom, when excess was celebrated, when private palaces were normal for the very wealthy. By the time she died in 1973, those values were gone. Excess was embarrassing. Private palaces were criticized. She had built for one era and lived into another. The palace that made sense in 1927 made no sense in 1973. She could not adapt, could not accept that the world had changed. She clung to Mar-a-Lago and it destroyed her. Trump bought Mar-a-Lago in 1985. By then, excess was coming back. The Reagan era. Greed is good. Wealth was celebrated again rather than criticized. Private clubs for the rich were fashionable. Trump's timing was perfect. He bought a palace that had destroyed its creator during the wrong era and revived it during the right era. Timing is everything. Marjorie's timing was tragic. Trump's timing was perfect. That difference determined everything. The question haunts anyone who studies Marjorie's story. Could she have been happy if she had never built Mar-a-Lago? If she had lived more modestly? If she had not tried to prove herself through architecture? The answer is unknowable. But the evidence suggests yes. Her marriages failed partly because of her wealth. But Mar-a-Lago made it worse. The palace was a constant reminder of the inequality. Every man who married her had to live there, had to be surrounded by her money, had to host parties in rooms she owned. The building crushed the relationships. Her fortune would have lasted if she had not built Mar-a-Lago. The operating costs consumed millions over the decades. Money that could have been invested. That could have generated income. That could have supported causes she cared about. Instead, it went to maintaining a palace that served no purpose except her pride. The waste was staggering. The opportunity cost was incalculable. She bought beauty. She got misery. The trade was catastrophic. The final cruelty was that Mar-a-Lago survived and prospered after her death. The building she loved more than anything became famous, became valuable, became important. Just not in her lifetime, not under her ownership. She died thinking it was worthless, thinking no one wanted it, thinking her masterpiece was a failure. She never knew that Mar-a-Lago would become one of the most famous private estates in America, that it would be photographed millions of times, that its name would be known worldwide. She died believing she had failed. She was wrong, but she never knew it. The story of Mar-a-Lago did not end with Trump's purchase. It transformed into something entirely different. Something Marjorie Merriweather Post could never have imagined when she drew the first plans in 1924. The palace she built for private glory became a symbol of public power. The estate that had consumed her life would consume the nation's attention decades after her death. But to understand why Mar-a-Lago mattered beyond Marjorie, you have to understand what she represented and what she lost along the way. Marjorie Merriweather Post was not just a woman with money. She was a woman who understood money. She inherited the Post cereal company at 27 and made it larger. She expanded product lines. She approved acquisitions. She understood that businesses must grow or die. When the company merged with others to form General Foods in 1929, she negotiated from a position of strength. She emerged wealthy beyond her father's wildest dreams. But the wealth was a burden as much as a blessing. It separated her from normal life, from normal relationships, from normal problems. She had never worried about rent, never worried about groceries, never worried about whether her children could attend good schools. Those concerns that defined most lives were absent from hers. In their place was a different set of worries. How to preserve the fortune, how to spend it meaningfully, how to matter beyond just having money. Mar-a-Lago was supposed to answer that last question. She would matter by creating something beautiful, something permanent, something that would outlast her and prove she had been more than a wallet. The problem was that the creation consumed the creator. Every dollar spent on Mar-a-Lago was a dollar not spent elsewhere. Every hour devoted to the estate was an hour not given to other pursuits. The palace became her identity. Without it, who was she? Just another rich woman. With it, she was the woman who built Mar-a-Lago. The estate defined her, and eventually imprisoned her. The other estates she owned revealed the pattern. Mar-a-Lago was not her only property. She maintained homes in Washington, D.C., in the Adirondacks, in Manhattan. Each one was elaborate. Each one was staffed. Each one consumed resources. But Mar-a-Lago was different. The other homes were places she lived. Mar-a-Lago was a statement she was making. The difference mattered. You can reduce costs at a home. You can close rooms, fire staff, lower the heat. But you cannot reduce a statement without diminishing it. Mar-a-Lago had to be magnificent or it was nothing. There was no middle ground. Her Washington residence was called Hillwood. It was impressive but manageable. Marjorie filled it with Russian art and antiques collected during her years as an ambassador's wife. Faberge eggs, imperial porcelain, treasures from the Romanov dynasty. Hillwood became a museum after her death. It still operates today. Visitors tour the rooms and view the collections. The operating costs are covered by admission fees and donations. The model works. Hillwood survives because it serves a public purpose. Mar-a-Lago was never designed to serve anyone but Marjorie. That was the fatal flaw. The Adirondack camp was called Topridge. Over 60 buildings scattered across hundreds of acres in upstate New York. A wilderness retreat for summer months. But even Topridge was modest compared to Mar-a-Lago. The buildings were rustic. The staffing was seasonal. The costs were manageable. Marjorie could enjoy Topridge without it consuming her fortune. The same was never true of Mar-a-Lago. The Palm Beach Palace demanded constant attention, constant spending, constant sacrifice. It was the demanding child that never grew up, that never left home, that never stopped needing more. Marjorie's philanthropy was substantial but overshadowed by her lifestyle. She donated millions to hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions. The National Symphony Orchestra received major support. The Kennedy Center acknowledged her contributions. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts benefited from her generosity. She gave money to causes she believed in throughout her life. But those donations were footnotes. When people thought of Marjorie Merriweather Post, they thought of Mar-a-Lago. The charitable giving was forgotten. The palace was remembered. She built something so memorable that it eclipsed everything else she did. Her daughters inherited her fortune but not her obsession. Adelaide, Eleanor, and Nadinia all lived well, but none attempted to maintain estates on the scale of Mar-a-Lago. They had watched their mother struggle. They understood the burden such properties created. They chose differently. They bought reasonable homes. They managed their wealth carefully. They did not try to make statements through architecture. Their mother's lesson had been learned, just not by her. Nadinia was the most famous of the three. She became an actress under the name Dina Merrill. She appeared in films and television throughout the 1950s and 1960s. She was beautiful and talented, but she was always identified as Marjorie Merriweather Post's daughter, always connected to the serial fortune, always asked about Mar-a-Lago. She could never escape her mother's shadow, just as her mother could never escape the shadow of the palace. The pattern repeated across generations, great wealth casting shadows that followed the family everywhere. The psychology of Mar-a-Lago's grip on Marjorie defied simple explanation. She was intelligent. She was capable. She understood business and money. She knew the costs were unsustainable. She knew the estate was consuming her fortune. But she could not let go. The palace had become her identity. To sell it would be to admit failure. To give it away would be to acknowledge it was worthless. Neither option was acceptable, so she held on, year after year, paying the costs, maintaining the fiction that Mar-a-Lago made sense, until she was old and broken and desperate, and the fiction could no longer be maintained. Some observers blamed the era in which she was raised. Marjorie came of age in the Gilded Age, when excess was celebrated, when private palaces were normal for the very wealthy. She was taught that great wealth should be displayed, that beautiful things should be owned and shown, that building grandly was a virtue rather than a vice. Those values shaped her. When the world changed after World War II, she could not change with it. She kept building and spending as if the 1920s had never ended, as if excess was still admirable. The world moved on. She stayed frozen in the values of her youth. Others blamed her father's legacy. C.W. Post had built an empire from nothing. He had proved himself through achievement. Marjorie inherited the result but not the journey. She never had to struggle, never had to prove herself through work. The fortune was simply given to her. That gift came with a burden. How do you prove yourself worthy of something you did not earn? Marjorie tried to prove herself through Mar-a-Lago, through building something magnificent, through creating rather than just inheriting. But the creation proved her undoing. She built too magnificently, created too grandly, and was destroyed by her own ambition. The saddest interpretation was that she was simply lonely. 4 marriages ending in divorce. Children who loved her but lived their own lives. Grandchildren who visited occasionally. Staff who served her but were not family. She filled Mar-a-Lago with guests because an empty palace is a tomb. She entertained constantly because silence in 128 rooms is unbearable. She could not let go of the estate because then she would have nothing. The palace was her purpose, her identity, her reason to wake up in the morning. Without it, she would be just another elderly widow with money and nothing to do. Mar-a-Lago gave her life meaning, even as it drained that life away. Trump's transformation of the estate was the opposite of everything Marjorie had wanted. She built Mar-a-Lago for privacy, for exclusivity, for her family alone. Trump opened it to anyone with enough money for membership. She built it for elegance and taste. Trump added his name in gold letters. She built it for quiet dignity. Trump made it a center of publicity and controversy. The palace remained, but the soul changed completely. Under Trump's ownership, Mar-a-Lago became famous for events and parties. Celebrity weddings were held there. Charity galas attracted media attention. The estate appeared in magazines and newspapers regularly. Marjorie had sought social acceptance through Mar-a-Lago. Trump achieved it through relentless promotion. He understood that fame was a product to be manufactured. Mar-a-Lago was a factory for producing that product. Every photograph, every news story, every mention added to the brand value. The membership model was brilliantly cynical. Wealthy people paid enormous fees for the privilege of associating with Mar-a-Lago, not with Trump specifically, with the name, with the history, with the idea that membership meant you had arrived. The exclusivity was manufactured but effective. People who could afford private clubs anywhere chose Mar-a-Lago because it sounded better. The name Marjorie had given it in the 1920s, Sea to Lake, became the most valuable asset. She had branded the estate perfectly. Trump simply exploited that branding. The irony was that Marjorie would have been horrified by what Mar-a-Lago became. She would have hated the commercialization, the gold letters, the paying members she did not choose, the publicity she never wanted. But she would have understood the business logic. She was a businesswoman herself. She would have recognized that Trump's model worked where hers had failed. He made Mar-a-Lago sustainable. He made it profitable. He solved the problem that had destroyed her. She just would have hated the solution. By 2016, Mar-a-Lago had evolved beyond even Trump's original vision. It became a political destination, a place where important people gathered, a stage for meetings and announcements. The winter White House that Marjorie had tried to create through donation, Trump created through ownership. The presidents she had hosted as guests, he hosted as owner. The dream she could not achieve through generosity, he achieved through self-promotion. The political transformation raised questions Marjorie never faced. When a president owns a private club, who really benefits from gatherings there? When foreign diplomats visit, are they meeting the president or promoting the club? When decisions are discussed in private rooms, who else is listening? Marjorie had offered Mar-a-Lago to the government precisely to avoid such questions. A government-owned winter White House would be clearly public property. A privately owned estate used for government purposes was something else entirely. Marjorie would have understood the dilemma. She had spent decades navigating the intersection of private wealth and public life. Her third husband had been an ambassador. She had hosted diplomatic events at Mar-a-Lago throughout the 1940s. She knew how private spaces could serve public purposes. But she also knew the importance of boundaries, of keeping personal interests separate from national interests. The blurring of those lines under Trump's ownership would have troubled her deeply. The physical estate changed surprisingly little over the decades. The tower still rose 75 feet. The Spanish tiles still covered the floors. The gold leaf still decorated the ceilings. Trump preserved much of Marjorie's original design. He understood that the history was part of the value. Changing it too much would destroy what made it special. The palace that Marjorie built in the 1920s was essentially the palace Trump owned in the 2020s. The container remained. Only the contents and purpose had changed. The operating costs that had destroyed Marjorie were absorbed easily by the club model. Hundreds of members paying dues covered expenses that one owner could not. The mathematics that had been impossible for an individual worked perfectly for a collective. The lesson was obvious but painful. Mar-a-Lago was never meant to be owned by one person. It was always too large, too expensive, too grand for individual ownership. Marjorie's insistence on keeping it private was the source of all her problems. If she had opened it to members in the 1960s, she might have lived her final years in peace rather than desperation. But that observation missed something important. Marjorie built Mar-a-Lago for specific purposes: to prove herself, to establish her status, to create a private paradise. Converting it to a club would have defeated those purposes. It would have been an admission that she could not afford what she had built, that her eyes were bigger than her wallet, that her ambition exceeded her resources. She could not admit that. Her pride would not allow it, so she suffered instead. She paid the costs and bore the burden and died heartbroken rather than admit she had built something too grand. Pride destroyed her, not poverty, not bad luck. Pride. The tragedy of Marjorie Merriweather Post was not that she was wrong to build Mar-a-Lago. The building was and remains beautiful. It was a genuine achievement, a masterpiece of American architecture. She was right to be proud of it. The tragedy was that she could not adapt when circumstances changed. She could not modify her vision, could not accept that the world had moved on from private palaces, could not find a new purpose for the estate when the old purpose no longer worked. She was frozen in 1927 while the calendar moved to 1973. That rigidity killed her. The building survived her rigidity. It stands today because someone else was willing to adapt, to change, to find new purposes when old ones failed. Trump was not a better person than Marjorie. He was simply more flexible. He saw the estate not as a permanent statement, but as an evolving opportunity. That flexibility allowed the building to survive. Marjorie built Mar-a-Lago. Trump saved it. Neither could have existed without the other, the creator and the savior, bound together across decades by a palace that destroyed one and elevated the other. The question of what Mar-a-Lago meant extended beyond Marjorie and beyond Trump. The estate represented something larger, a particular American dream, the belief that enough money could buy anything: respectability, acceptance, immortality. Marjorie believed that building the most magnificent estate in America would prove she belonged among the American aristocracy. That belief was both her motivation and her mistake, because belonging cannot be purchased. It can only be earned. And buildings, no matter how beautiful, cannot earn it for you. The American aristocracy that Marjorie sought to join was itself an illusion. America had no titled nobility, no hereditary lords, no official class system, but it had something almost as rigid: old money, families whose wealth dated to colonial times or the early industrial era. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers. These names carried weight not just because of current wealth, but because of historical wealth. Their money was seasoned, aged, respectable in ways that new money could never be. Marjorie's fortune was barely a generation old when she built Mar-a-Lago. Her father had made it. She had inherited it. That made her new money. And new money was never quite acceptable to old money, no matter how much of it she spent. The irony was that old money families faced the same problems Marjorie did. The Vanderbilt mansions in Newport became too expensive to maintain. Biltmore in North Carolina nearly bankrupted its owners. The great estates of the Gilded Age were all becoming burdens by mid-century. Taxes and changing times affected everyone, but old money families had something Marjorie lacked: perspective. They understood that fortunes rise and fall, that estates come and go. They could sell their palaces without shame because their identity did not depend on any single building. Marjorie had built her entire identity around Mar-a-Lago. She could not let it go because she did not know who she would be without it. The comparison to European aristocracy was instructive. Marjorie had modeled Mar-a-Lago on European palaces. She had imported European materials and craftsmen. She had filled the house with European antiques. She wanted to create something equal to what European nobility possessed. But European aristocrats had something American heiresses could never have: centuries of history, bloodlines that connected them to kings and crusaders, titles granted by monarchs long dead. Those things could not be purchased at any price. Marjorie could buy the furniture from a French chateau. She could not buy the history that made the chateau meaningful. Her palace was beautiful but rootless, magnificent but meaningless in the way that truly historic buildings were meaningful. Palm Beach itself was part of the problem. The island had been developed specifically for wealthy Americans seeking winter escape. It was artificial from the beginning, a playground created by developers and railroad magnates. The mansions that lined its shores were not ancestral homes passed down through generations. They were vacation properties built by people who had made money elsewhere. Everyone in Palm Beach was new money by definition. The island had no history before the 1890s. No traditions older than a single lifetime. Mar-a-Lago was the grandest estate in a community of grand estates. But grandest among the rootless was still rootless. Marjorie tried to create traditions where none existed. She established routines at Mar-a-Lago, annual parties on specific dates, rituals of hosting and entertaining. She wanted future generations to continue these traditions, to make Mar-a-Lago a family seat that would endure for centuries. But traditions cannot be created by decree. They evolve over time. They require multiple generations of repetition. Marjorie had only one lifetime. She could establish practices. She could not establish traditions. The distinction mattered more than she understood. Her children and grandchildren did not share her attachment to Mar-a-Lago. They visited dutifully. They enjoyed the luxury, but they did not feel the emotional connection Marjorie felt. For them, it was grandmother's house, impressive but not essential. When Marjorie died, they did not fight to keep it. They did not sacrifice to maintain it. They sold it as quickly as they could. The traditions Marjorie had tried to establish died with her. The family connection to Mar-a-Lago lasted exactly one generation, her generation. The failure of legacy was perhaps the cruelest irony. Marjorie built Mar-a-Lago specifically to create a legacy, something permanent that would outlast her, something her descendants would treasure. But her descendants did not treasure it. They saw it as a burden, an expensive obligation, a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be cherished. The legacy she intended was rejected by the very people it was meant for. She had built a monument to herself. Her family saw only the maintenance bills. The cultural changes of the 1960s made everything worse. The decade brought a upheaval to American society. Civil rights movements challenged old hierarchies. Youth culture rejected establishment values. The Vietnam War divided generations. In this context, a 128-room palace built by a serial heiress seemed obscene. The excess that had been celebrated in the 1920s was condemned in the 1960s. Marjorie found herself on the wrong side of history. Her values were outdated. Her lifestyle was criticized. Her palace was an embarrassment rather than an achievement. She tried to respond to the changing times. She increased her charitable giving. She supported causes that seemed relevant. She tried to demonstrate that wealth could be used responsibly. But Mar-a-Lago undermined all of it. How could she claim to care about social problems while maintaining a 128-room palace? How could she advocate for responsibility while spending millions on personal luxury? The contradiction was inescapable. Mar-a-Lago made her look like a hypocrite no matter what else she did. The staff who maintained Mar-a-Lago had their own perspectives. 60 to 70 employees worked there year-round. Groundskeepers who maintained the gardens. Housekeepers who cleaned rooms that were rarely used. Cooks who prepared meals for one elderly woman. Security guards who protected an empty palace. These workers depended on Mar-a-Lago for their livelihoods. They understood that when Marjorie died, their jobs would disappear. The estate would be sold or closed. They would have to find work elsewhere. Their loyalty to Marjorie was mixed with self-interest. Keeping her happy meant keeping their jobs. Some staff members genuinely loved Marjorie. She could be generous and kind. She remembered birthdays. She helped with family emergencies. She treated longtime employees like extended family. But she could also be demanding and difficult. She expected perfection in all things. A flower arrangement slightly wrong, a meal not quite right, a room not perfectly clean. She noticed everything, and she was not shy about expressing displeasure. The staff learned to anticipate her needs, to fix problems before she noticed them, to maintain the fiction that Mar-a-Lago ran itself effortlessly. The economic impact on Palm Beach was significant. Mar-a-Lago employed more people than most businesses in the area. The payroll pumped money into local shops and services. Suppliers who provided food and materials depended on the estate. When Marjorie reduced spending in her final years, the effects rippled through the community. Local businesses suffered, workers had hours cut. The decline of Mar-a-Lago affected more than just Marjorie. The environmental footprint of the estate was enormous by modern standards. Maintaining 17 acres of tropical gardens required constant irrigation. The water consumption was massive. The energy to heat and cool 128 rooms was substantial. The chemicals used on lawns and gardens polluted runoff. None of this was considered problematic in the 1920s when the estate was built. But by the 1970s, environmental awareness was growing. Mar-a-Lago was an ecological disaster as well as a financial one. Another way the world had changed and left Marjorie behind. The architecture of Mar-a-Lago reflected its era in ways that became problematic. The Spanish Moorish, Venetian style that seemed exotic and beautiful in the 1920s looked confused and overdone by the 1970s. Architectural tastes had changed. Modernism had become dominant. Clean lines and simple forms were valued. Mar-a-Lago's ornate decoration seemed fussy and old-fashioned. The gold leaf that had impressed visitors in 1927 seemed gaudy and tasteless in 1973. The building had not changed, but perceptions of it had changed completely. Some preservationists recognized Mar-a-Lago's historical value even as others criticized its excess. The estate was a remarkable example of 1920s craftsmanship. The imported materials and skilled work could never be replicated. The building was a time capsule, a window into a vanished era. These preservationists argued that Mar-a-Lago should be saved regardless of current tastes. Historic buildings deserve protection because they tell us about the past, not because we approve of the values they represent. Marjorie would have welcomed preservation efforts if they had solved her problem. She did not care whether people approved of her taste. She cared whether someone would take responsibility for the estate. If preservationists wanted to save Mar-a-Lago, let them save it. Let them pay the bills. Let them maintain the gardens and repair the roof and keep the staff employed. But preservationists had no money for such projects. They could advocate for saving buildings. They could not pay to save them. Their concern was genuine but useless to Marjorie. The final years at Mar-a-Lago were exercises in managed decline. Marjorie knew she was dying. She knew the estate would outlive her. She knew her family would sell it. She tried to prepare for the transition. She cataloged the contents. She identified items of particular value. She made provisions in her will for distribution of furnishings. She tried to control what she could control. Even as everything else slipped away, the cataloging revealed the scope of what she had accumulated. Thousands of pieces of furniture, hundreds of paintings and artworks, countless decorative objects, silver and china and crystal, linens and rugs and tapestries. The contents of Mar-a-Lago were worth millions on their own. Separate from the building and land, Marjorie had spent decades acquiring these things. Now they would be dispersed, sold at auction, scattered to new owners. The collection she had assembled with such care would be dismantled. Another form of death. The death of a life's work. She gave away what she could before dying. Items to museums. Items to family members. Items to loyal staff. She wanted to control the destination of her treasures. But most had to be left for the estate to handle. The scale was too large for individual distribution. The auction after her death would last for days. Dealers and collectors competing for pieces of her life, strangers pawing through her possessions, judging and evaluating and bidding. It was a form of violation, but it was also inevitable. You cannot take it with you. Someone always inherits. Someone always disperses. The collections we build are temporary. The buildings we construct outlast us only to serve different purposes. Marjorie's health declined steadily through 1973. The heart that had driven her for 86 years was failing. She spent more and more time in bed. The doctor visited daily. The staff worried and whispered. Everyone knew the end was coming. The only question was when. She had time to reflect in those final months. Time to consider what her life had meant, what she had achieved, what she had failed to achieve. The balance sheet was mixed. She had preserved and grown her father's fortune. She had raised 3 daughters who became capable adults. She had supported countless charitable causes. She had built magnificent estates and filled them with beautiful things. She had lived more grandly than almost anyone in American history. By most measures, her life was a spectacular success. But she did not feel successful. She felt trapped. She felt alone. She felt that her greatest creation had become her greatest burden. Mar-a-Lago was supposed to be her triumph. Instead, it was her tragedy. The palace that was meant to prove her greatness had proved only that even greatness can become a prison. The walls she had built to shelter her had become walls she could not escape. The letter from the government rejecting Mar-a-Lago sat on her desk. She read it repeatedly. Each reading hurt anew. They did not want her gift. They did not want her legacy. They did not want the things she had devoted her life to creating. The rejection was complete, not just of the building, of her, of everything she had tried to be. The government had looked at her life's work and said, "No, thank you. We do not want it, even for free, even with no strings attached. We simply do not want it." She died believing she had failed, believing Mar-a-Lago was worthless, believing no one would ever want the palace she had built. She could not know that within a decade, someone would buy it. That within 2 decades, it would be famous. That within 3 decades, it would be one of the most recognized estates in America. She died in despair, not knowing that the future would vindicate her creation, that Mar-a-Lago would matter, just not in the way she had intended. The morning of September 12, 1973, was unremarkable, warm and sunny. A typical Palm Beach day. Marjorie woke early as usual. She felt tired, weaker than usual. She called for the nurse. Before the nurse arrived, her heart stopped. 86 years of beating, billions of contractions, then nothing. Marjorie Merriweather Post was dead. The palace continued. The staff continued their duties. The gardens continued to bloom. The fountain continued to flow. Everything continued except the woman who had created it all. The news of her death spread quickly through Palm Beach, then through American high society, then through the media. Obituaries praised her philanthropy and taste. They described Mar-a-Lago in loving detail. They celebrated her as one of the last great hostesses, one of the last connections to the Gilded Age, one of the last Americans who lived like European royalty. The obituaries were kind. They did not mention her loneliness, her desperation, her failed attempt to give away the palace. They remembered the glory. They forgot the pain. The funeral was held 3 days after Marjorie's death. A small private service at the National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. Family members gathered. Close friends attended. The public was not invited. Marjorie had spent her life in the spotlight. Her family wanted her departure to be private, quiet, dignified. The opposite of the grand parties she had hosted for decades. The casket was closed. Marjorie had always been conscious of her appearance. She would not have wanted people seeing her in death. She was buried at Hillwood, her Washington estate, not at Mar-a-Lago. The choice was significant. Hillwood was manageable, sustainable. It would become a museum as she had planned. Mar-a-Lago was the problem child. The estate she loved most was not where she wanted to rest. Perhaps she understood that Mar-a-Lago's future was uncertain, that it might pass to strangers, that her grave there would be visited by people she had never known. Hillwood was safer, more controlled, more permanent in the way she wanted permanence. The reading of the will revealed the complexity of her estate. Multiple properties, vast collections, investments and trusts. The distribution took years to complete. Lawyers and accountants worked through the details. Family members received their shares. Charitable organizations received their bequests. But Mar-a-Lago remained the central problem. The property that no one wanted. The asset that was actually a liability. The inheritance that felt more like a curse. The estate initially tried to maintain Mar-a-Lago as Marjorie had maintained it. Reduced staff kept the grounds presentable. Basic security protected the property. Minimal repairs prevented obvious deterioration. But even minimal maintenance was expensive. The family was bleeding money on a property they could not use and could not sell. Every month brought new bills. Every season brought new problems. The mathematics were relentless. The Palm Beach community watched with interest and concern. Mar-a-Lago was the most significant property on the island. Its fate mattered to everyone. If it fell into disrepair, property values throughout Palm Beach would suffer. If it was demolished for development, the character of the island would change forever. If it was subdivided into smaller lots, traffic and density would increase. Every possible outcome had implications beyond the property itself. Local preservationists began organizing. They recognized Mar-a-Lago's historical significance. The estate was a masterpiece of 1920s architecture. The craftsmanship was irreplaceable. The materials could never be sourced again. The building deserved protection, but protection required money. And preservationists had passion but not resources. They could advocate. They could not purchase. The estate explored every option. Sale to a wealthy individual, conversion to a hotel, donation to a university, use as a conference center. Each option had fatal flaws. Individuals could not afford the operating costs. Hotels required zoning changes Palm Beach would never approve. Universities had no use for a 128-room palace in Florida. Conference centers needed proximity to airports and cities that Palm Beach lacked. Every door the estate knocked on remained closed. The years passed slowly. 1975, 1976. Mar-a-Lago sat empty and waiting. The tropical climate was unforgiving. Salt air corroded metal. Humidity damaged wood. Insects invaded spaces that were not constantly maintained. The estate that Marjorie had kept immaculate began showing signs of neglect. Paint peeled. Gardens overgrew. Fountains stopped flowing. The palace was dying slowly, rotting from the inside while the family searched desperately for a buyer. The Post Foundation considered options more carefully in the late 1970s. Perhaps they could operate Mar-a-Lago themselves, not as a private residence, as something else. A museum like Hillwood, a cultural center, a venue for events. The foundation had resources. It had organizational capacity. It could potentially make Mar-a-Lago work where individuals could not. But the foundation's analysis was discouraging. The operating costs remained prohibitive. The location was wrong for a museum. Palm Beach was a winter resort, not a year-round destination. Attendance would be seasonal at best. The revenue could never cover the expenses. The foundation would be subsidizing Mar-a-Lago indefinitely, draining resources from other programs to maintain a building that served no clear purpose. The board rejected the idea. Mar-a-Lago would have to be sold. At whatever price the market would bear, the asking price dropped steadily through the early 1980s. 20 million became 15. 15 became 12. 12 became 10. Each reduction acknowledged reality. No one would pay what the estate was theoretically worth. They would only pay what someone was actually willing to spend, and that number kept falling. Donald Trump first saw Mar-a-Lago in 1982. He was 36 years old, a rising star in New York real estate. He had built Trump Tower in Manhattan. He was developing casinos in Atlantic City. He was famous in ways that real estate developers rarely became. He understood the value of publicity, the power of branding, the importance of being known. Mar-a-Lago appealed to him immediately, not as a home, as a brand extension, as a statement, as proof that he had arrived among the truly wealthy. Trump's initial approach was characteristically aggressive. He offered $5 million. The estate was asking $15 million at the time. The offer was insulting. The estate rejected it without negotiation. Trump shrugged and waited. He knew the estate was desperate. He knew no other buyers were interested. Time was on his side. Every month the estate held Mar-a-Lago cost them money. Every month Trump waited cost him nothing. He made a second approach in 1984. The asking price had fallen further. The estate was more desperate. Trump offered $8 million, $5 million for the land and buildings, $3 million for the contents. Total $8 million for a property that had been valued at $20 million a decade earlier. The estate negotiated briefly, but they had no leverage. No other offers existed. No other buyers were interested. They accepted Trump's terms. The sale closed in December 1985. Trump became the owner of Mar-a-Lago. The most elaborate private residence in Florida was his. He had paid pennies on the dollar. Less than Marjorie had spent building it in 1927. Not accounting for inflation. Not accounting for decades of improvements. The deal was a masterpiece of patient negotiation. Trump had waited for desperation. Then he had struck. His plans for the property evolved over time. Initially, he considered living there himself, using it as a winter residence the way Marjorie had. But the operating costs gave him pause. The same costs that had destroyed Marjorie would destroy him too, unless he found a way to share them. The club model emerged gradually. Multiple members paying dues could support what one owner could not. The mathematics that had failed Marjorie could work for Trump if he restructured them. The conversion to a private club required approvals from Palm Beach Town Council. The neighbors opposed it immediately. They did not want a commercial operation in their residential neighborhood. They worried about traffic, about noise, about strangers having access to the area. They had purchased homes near Mar-a-Lago expecting it to remain a private residence. A club was different. A club was a business. Businesses did not belong in Palm Beach's most exclusive neighborhoods. Trump fought the opposition with characteristic aggression. He hired lawyers and consultants. He cultivated relationships with town council members. He made promises about limiting membership and controlling traffic. He threatened alternatives. If the town would not approve a club, he would subdivide the property. He would sell lots to developers. Multiple mansions would replace the single estate. The neighbors would have more traffic, not less. More strangers, not fewer. The threat worked because it was credible. Trump would absolutely subdivide if the club was denied. The town approved the club as the lesser evil. The membership structure was designed for maximum exclusivity. $100,000 to join initially. The price would rise over time. Annual dues of $14,000. Strict limits on total membership. Waiting lists for those wanting to join. The exclusivity was the product. Being a member meant you could afford to be a member. That you had been accepted. That you belonged to something most people could not access. The psychology was pure status marketing. The renovations required for club use were substantial. The building needed updating for commercial occupancy. Fire codes. Accessibility requirements. Kitchen expansions for restaurant service. Locker rooms for the pool and tennis facilities. The improvements cost millions. But Trump understood they were investments, not expenses. Every dollar spent improved the product he was selling. The better Mar-a-Lago looked, the more he could charge for membership. The club opened in 1995, 10 years after Trump purchased the property. A decade of negotiations, renovations, and preparations. The first members paid their fees and received their privileges. They could dine at Mar-a-Lago, swim in the pool Marjorie had built, play tennis on courts she had installed, attend parties in rooms she had decorated. They were experiencing Marjorie's creation, but filtered through Trump's commercial vision. The irony was lost on most members. They did not know Marjorie's story, did not know she had died heartbroken trying to give the property away, did not know the government had rejected it as too expensive. They knew only that Mar-a-Lago was exclusive and beautiful. That membership meant they had arrived. That being there connected them to wealth and power. The tragedy beneath the glamour was invisible. The history forgotten. Trump used Mar-a-Lago brilliantly for self-promotion. He hosted events that attracted media coverage. He invited celebrities and politicians. He made sure photographers captured the estate's beauty. Every image reinforced the Trump brand. Every story mentioned his ownership. Mar-a-Lago became synonymous with Trump in ways it had never been synonymous with Marjorie. She had owned it for 46 years. Within a decade, Trump had made it his. The parties at Mar-a-Lago under Trump were different from those under Marjorie. She had sought respectability. He sought publicity. She had invited guests carefully, considering their social standing. He invited anyone who would generate attention. She had valued discretion. He valued exposure. The same rooms served opposite purposes. The palace remained. The philosophy changed completely. The annual New Year's Eve galas became famous. Thousands of dollars per ticket. Celebrities and socialites competing for invitations. Media coverage guaranteed. The events were spectacles designed for maximum visibility. Everything Marjorie would have considered vulgar. But everything that worked in the modern media environment. Trump understood his era the way Marjorie had misunderstood hers. The membership evolved over the decades. Early members were primarily wealthy retirees seeking social connections. Later members were more diverse. Business people wanting networking opportunities. Politicians seeking donors. Celebrities wanting privacy among the elite. Foreign nationals attracted by the Trump brand. The club became an ecosystem. A place where money and power circulated. Where deals were discussed. Where relationships were formed. The dues increased steadily. 100,000 became 200,000. The annual fees rose proportionally. The exclusivity intensified as prices increased. Fewer people could afford membership. Those who could were wealthier than before. The club became more elite over time. Not less. The opposite of what might have been expected as it aged. Mar-a-Lago's profitability was difficult to assess from outside. Trump did not release financial statements. The club was privately held within his business empire. But observers could estimate based on membership numbers and fee structures. The revenue appeared substantial. Enough to cover operating costs that had destroyed Marjorie. Enough to generate profit beyond expenses. Enough to make the purchase one of Trump's best investments. The property value increased dramatically as well. Trump had paid $8 million in 1985. By 2000, estimates exceeded $50 million. By 2010, over $100 million. By 2020, some estimates reached $200 million or more. The appreciation was extraordinary. Marjorie had watched Mar-a-Lago destroy her fortune. Trump watched it multiply his. The same property, different eras, different outcomes. The transformation raised philosophical questions about ownership and value. Marjorie had believed that owning Mar-a-Lago made her significant, that the property reflected her achievement, that possessing beauty was itself an accomplishment. Trump believed something different, that properties were assets to be leveraged, that their value came from what you could extract, that ownership meant control, not identification. His approach was commercial. Hers had been personal. The commercial approach succeeded. The personal approach failed. The lesson seemed clear, but was actually complicated. Marjorie had not been wrong to build something beautiful. She had not been wrong to want permanence. She had not been wrong to seek meaning through creation. These were worthy goals. Her mistake was rigidity. The inability to adapt when circumstances changed. The refusal to modify her vision when reality demanded modification. If she had converted Mar-a-Lago to a club in the 1960s, she might have preserved it and profited from it. She might have lived her final years in comfort rather than desperation. She might have died proud rather than heartbroken. But that counterfactual assumed she could have changed. Could have accepted her palace becoming commercial. Could have tolerated strangers walking halls she had built for family. Could have endured seeing her vision compromised for economic survival. Perhaps she could not. Perhaps her personality made such adaptation impossible. Perhaps the same characteristics that drove her to build Mar-a-Lago also prevented her from saving it. The ambition and the rigidity might have been inseparable. The strength and the weakness the same trait viewed from different angles. Trump had no such rigidity. He adapted constantly, changed plans when they stopped working, modified approaches when better options emerged. He had no sentimental attachment to Mar-a-Lago beyond its utility. If circumstances had changed, if the club model had failed, he would have tried something else. Subdivided the property, converted it to a hotel, done whatever worked. That flexibility was his advantage. Marjorie's emotional investment was her disadvantage. The contrast illuminated something important about wealth and character. Having money did not determine how you used it. Marjorie and Trump both had fortunes. They used them differently. She built monuments. He built businesses. She sought permanence. He sought profit. She identified with her creations. He exploited his acquisitions. Neither approach was inherently superior. But in the context of Mar-a-Lago, his approach survived and hers did not. The estate that destroyed its creator made its new owner famous. The palace that consumed Marjorie's fortune multiplied Trump's. The property that killed her elevated him. The symmetry was almost too perfect, almost too cruel, as if fate had designed the story to illustrate a point, that the same thing can be poison or medicine depending on who consumes it. That context determines outcome. That timing is everything. Marjorie would not have recognized what Mar-a-Lago became. The events and galas, the paying members, the publicity seeking, the gold letters spelling Trump across the entrance. Her palace had been transformed into something alien, something she would have despised, but also something that survived, something that continued, something that still stood beautiful and maintained decades after her death. Was survival worth the transformation? Was preservation worth the compromise? These were questions without clear answers. Questions that haunted anyone who knew both versions of Mar-a-Lago. The building itself remained remarkably unchanged. The tower still rose 75 feet. The Spanish tiles still covered the floors. The gold leaf still decorated the ceilings. Trump had preserved Marjorie's architecture even as he transformed its purpose. He understood that the history was part of the value, that the beauty she had created was what people were paying to access. He was selling her vision, just packaging it differently than she had imagined. In some ways, this was a form of vindication. Mar-a-Lago mattered. The palace Marjorie had built was valuable, was beautiful, was worth preserving. She had been right about that. Her creation was worthy. Her execution was masterful. The building deserved to survive. It had just needed a different model to make survival possible. A model she could not accept. That Trump could. The story of Marjorie Merriweather Post is not really about a house. It is about what happens when ambition becomes obsession. When proving yourself becomes more important than living. When the thing you build to establish your legacy becomes the thing that consumes you. Mar-a-Lago was stone and tile and gold leaf. But it was also a trap. A beautiful trap that closed slowly around the woman who created it. By the time she understood what had happened, it was too late to escape. Consider what Marjorie wanted when she began. She was 27 years old. She had inherited an enormous fortune. But she had not earned it. Her father had built the Post Surreal Company from nothing. He had created the products and the business and the wealth. Then he shot himself and left everything to her. She was rich beyond imagining. But she was also guilty, undeserving. A woman who had done nothing except be born to the right father. The money felt like a burden as much as a blessing. She needed to prove she was more than an accident of birth. Building Mar-a-Lago was supposed to solve that problem. She would create something magnificent. Something that proved she had taste and vision and capability. Something that required her to make thousands of decisions. To impose her will on architects and craftsmen and materials. When the palace was finished, it would be her achievement. Not her father's. Not inherited. Created. She would be a builder rather than an heiress. A creator rather than a recipient. The palace would justify her existence. The logic was flawed from the beginning. No building can justify a life. No possession can prove worthiness. External achievements cannot solve internal doubts. Marjorie was looking for something that did not exist. A purchase that would make her feel like she deserved her fortune. That purchase does not exist. No matter how much you spend. No matter how beautiful the result. The emptiness remains. The doubt remains. Because the problem was never external. The problem was inside her, and you cannot build your way out of that. But she tried. For 46 years she tried. She filled Mar-a-Lago with guests and parties and events. She played the hostess perfectly. She made people feel important and welcomed. She created an atmosphere that everyone praised. But at the end of every party, the guests went home. And Marjorie was alone with 128 rooms and her doubts. The palace could distract her. It could not heal her. The wound from her father's death never closed. She just covered it with gold leaf and Spanish tiles. The marriages reveal the truth most clearly. 4 husbands, all eventually destroyed by her wealth. Edward Close could not handle the reversal when she inherited everything. Edward Hutton could not handle being Mr. Post. Joseph Davies could not handle living in her shadow. Herbert May was a mistake from the start. Each man entered the marriage expecting partnership. Each man discovered he would always be secondary. Her money was the foundation of every relationship, and foundations like that cannot support love. They can only support transactions. Mar-a-Lago made the marriage problem worse. Any man who lived there was surrounded by her money, her choices, her vision. He woke up in rooms she had designed. He ate meals in dining rooms she had furnished. He entertained guests in spaces she controlled. There was no escape from her dominance. Even the most confident man would eventually feel diminished. Edward Hutton was successful in his own right. E.F. Hutton & Company was a major Wall Street firm. But in Mar-a-Lago, he was just the husband, just a guest in his wife's palace. The building poisoned every relationship that entered it. The timing of her life was cruel. She was born in 1887. She inherited in 1914. She built Mar-a-Lago in the 1920s. That was the era when private palaces made sense, when income taxes were minimal, when the wealthy could spend freely without criticism. When building the biggest house was a reasonable ambition, she was a creature of that era. Its values made sense to her. But she lived until 1973. By then, everything had changed. Excess was embarrassing. Private palaces were criticized. Taxes had consumed the fortunes that built such things. She had built for one world and survived into another. The palace that made sense in 1927 was an absurdity in 1973. She could not adapt. That was the final tragedy. Other wealthy families sold their palaces when the world changed. They moved to smaller properties. They simplified their lives. They accepted that an era had ended. Marjorie could not. Mar-a-Lago was not just a house to her. It was her identity, her achievement, her proof that she mattered. Selling it would mean admitting failure, admitting that her great project had been a mistake. She was not capable of that admission, so she held on, year after year, paying $1 million annually, watching her fortune shrink, trapped by pride in a cage of her own construction. The desperate attempts to give it away revealed how trapped she was. She tried everything: charities, foundations, the state government, the federal government. Please take this palace off my hands. I will give it to you for free. Just take it. No one wanted it. The operating costs scared everyone away. The liability was too great. The burden was too heavy. She had created something so magnificent that no one could afford to accept it. The very success of her building was its fatal flaw. She had built too well, too beautifully, too expensively. Excellence became curse. When the government refused her final offer in December 1973, something inside her died. That is not metaphor. That is description. She stopped living in any meaningful sense after that rejection. She ate. She breathed. Her heart continued beating for 9 more months. But she was already gone. The rejection proved what she had feared all along. She had failed. Her great achievement was worthless. No one wanted it. The palace that was supposed to establish her legacy had become evidence of her foolishness. She died believing she was a failure. That is the cruelest part of her story. Because she was wrong. Mar-a-Lago did not fail. She died too soon to see it succeed. Trump bought it in 1985, converted it to a club, made it profitable, made it famous. The property that no one wanted in 1973 became one of the most recognized estates in America. Presidents have stayed there. World leaders have visited. Millions of photographs have been taken. The name Mar-a-Lago is known globally. The palace Marjorie built did exactly what she hoped. It achieved immortality. It outlasted its creator. It became legendary. She never knew. She died thinking her masterpiece was a failure. She never saw it become famous. Never saw it prosper. Never saw her vision vindicated. That is the tragedy. She built something that succeeded spectacularly, but she died believing it had failed. The timing was off by just a few years. If she had lived into the 1980s, if she had seen Trump's conversion, if she had witnessed the club's success, would it have healed her? Would it have given her peace? We cannot know. But she deserved to know. She deserved to see her creation succeed. Instead, she died heartbroken in a palace she thought nobody wanted. The lesson of Mar-a-Lago is not about buildings. It is about the danger of external validation. Marjorie needed approval from others. She needed people to recognize her greatness. She needed the world to confirm that she deserved her fortune. That need drove her to build Mar-a-Lago. That need made her unable to sell it when it became a burden. That need kept her prisoner in 128 rooms. If she had not needed approval so desperately, she could have lived differently, more modestly, more happily. The fortune would have remained. The marriages might have succeeded. Her final years would not have been lonely and desperate. But needing approval is human. Wanting recognition is natural. She was not wrong to want those things. She was wrong about how to get them. She thought building a palace would force acceptance. It did not. She thought owning beautiful things would prove she had taste. It did not. She thought spending money would demonstrate worthiness. It did not. Approval cannot be purchased. Recognition cannot be built. These things come from within or not at all. She was looking in the wrong place, and by the time she realized that, it was too late. The mansion outlived its purpose and its creator. That is the final irony. Mar-a-Lago still stands. It is still beautiful. It is still famous. Marjorie is gone. Her story is largely forgotten. People who visit Mar-a-Lago today rarely know who built it. They know its current associations. They know its recent history. They do not know the woman who spent a fortune creating it, who lived there for 46 years, who tried desperately to give it away, who died heartbroken in its rooms. Her palace survived. Her memory did not. That is the nature of buildings. They outlast the people who create them. And eventually the people are forgotten. What remains is the cautionary tale. Wealth cannot buy happiness. This is a cliché because it is true. Marjorie had everything money could purchase. She was still miserable. She was still lonely. She still died feeling like a failure. The fortune that her father built and she inherited could not protect her from despair, could not give her lasting love, could not make her feel worthy. Money solved many problems but created others. The problems it created were ultimately worse than the problems it solved. The palace was meant to elevate her, became the cage that trapped her. That sentence summarizes everything. She built Mar-a-Lago to rise above her origins, to prove she was more than a serial heiress, to establish herself as a creator and a patron. Instead, the palace consumed her. The costs drained her fortune. The maintenance dominated her life. The building became an obligation she could not escape. She was not elevated. She was trapped by beauty, by expense, by pride that would not let her walk away. Her story is not about Trump. It is not about politics. It is not about what Mar-a-Lago became after she died. Her story is about the danger of building monuments to yourself, about the hubris of creating palaces to prove your worth, about the way ambition can consume the person who holds it. She wanted to be remembered. She wanted to matter. She wanted to leave something permanent behind. She achieved all of those goals, and she was destroyed by the achieving. September 12, 1973. Marjorie Merriweather Post died alone in her palace. 86 years old. 4 marriages ended. Fortune shrinking. Palace unwanted. Legacy rejected. Heartbroken. The woman who had once been the wealthiest woman in America, who had entertained presidents and ambassadors, who had built the most magnificent private estate in Florida. She died feeling like a failure, in a house with 128 rooms, surrounded by staff who could not comfort her, haunted by memories of what she had hoped Mar-a-Lago would mean. and what it had actually become. The mansion still stands. The tower still rises 75 feet above Palm Beach. The gold leaf still decorates the ceilings. The Spanish tiles still cover the walls. The rooms are still beautiful. And somewhere in those rooms, the ghost of Marjorie Merriweather Post still wanders. Still wondering why no one wanted her gift. Still asking why her masterpiece became her prison. Still searching for the approval she never found. Still trapped in the palace that destroyed her. Mar-a-Lago.